Guatemala, a bustling country of rich culture. Home to one of the oldest, most advanced civilizations in history. For years, archaeologists have worked with individuals from local communities to conduct research deep in the jungle and uncover ancient stories of the Maya. Over 500 kilometers away from Guatemala City, in the Peten rainforest, archaeologist and professor at the College of Wooster, Dr. Olivia Navarro-Farr, and a team of colleagues work at the archaeological site of El Perú-Waka, an ancient city now engulfed in the native jungle flora and fauna. This field season, they have discovered what could open a new chapter of Maya history.
El Perú-Waka is located in northwestern Peten, which is the northernmost department in the country of Guatemala. It's in a region that we Mayanists refer to as the southern Maya lowlands, in a sort of lowland tropical rainforest. It is geographically located within the Laguna del Tigre National Park. Back when I was a graduate student, I used to get there on a bus. On a bus or some other mode of vehicle transportation, it takes about a 6 or 7 hour ride. Now I typically fly to Peten from Guatemala City, and in the air it's about an hour from Guatemala City to Flores Municipal Airport. From there, we'll take a truck or vehicle into the sector where the park is located. That's at least a couple hours, somewhat bumpy ride. Once you get into the vicinity of the park, you'll enter into the community of Paso Caballos, which is a Quechua Maya community. Paso Caballos practices subsistence agriculture. That activity makes the roads in that community bumpier because there's less vegetation to sort of keep the truck balanced. And then once in Paso Caballos, depending on the state of the road, depending on the time of year, if it's rainy season or dry season, and other factors, one might either continue in vehicle or take a boat, because the community of Paso Caballos is right on the San Pedro Martir River. And so you can get a motorboat and go in on the river up to the point of the dock called El Venado, and then from there you disembark and take another vehicle up to the base camp. The conditions at camp, I think they're pretty good, but in comparison to the way that we live, let's say here in Wooster or anywhere, the physical challenges are very real. We live in tents. We have showers that bring water from the Cibal, which is like this kind of freshwater lake that's covered with grass. And we're camped right next to that because it's our source of fresh water, which is vital, right? But it pumps in this water, which is, green in its natural state. And we use that unfiltered to wash ourselves. And then we have filters to purify the water for cooking and drinking. And so once it's filtered heavily with this equipment, it still has like a slightly yellow color. And if you're new to that, you're gonna sort of look at it and say, oh, okay, that's the color of the water here, right? Might be a little different for you, but it tastes fine. We don't have flush toilets, we have latrines. We have no refrigeration. We do bring food that necessitates refrigeration. And so once we bring it in, we keep it on ice and sort of eat it fairly immediately. Archaeology and fieldwork really tests one's sense of self. They test one's sense of what one is used to, what one can be comfortable with, what one can grow accustomed to. So, yeah, the jaguar. Grande. So you can see the scale. It's pretty big. Once one has grown accustomed to those challenges, I feel like that changes one kind of forever. You sort of never think about your life and the niceties of daily life in your real world context the same way ever again. Those are the noisy birds on top of our tents. Ian Graham was a British archaeologist, epigrapher, and he worked for the Corpus of Maya hieroglyphic inscriptions in his later career. And he was really an incredible person. I wouldn't characterize any sort of Western or European explorer as discovering any site in the ancient world. Typically, such explorers, investigators, researchers were guided to those places by local people, and the same is true of Ian. And in his book, Road to Ruins, he talks in his memoirs about the local people who guided him into all these different sites in the Peten, including El Peru, which that's the name it was given in more modern times, and we as a project have worked to hyphenate it. So El Peru is the more modern name, Waka is the ancient name, and so we hyphenate to sort of give deference to both. He investigated this site and particularly was interested in the carved monuments. Just before that time, there had been interest in oil prospecting and looking for petróleo in the area, and so that led to an influx of people, which led to an increased elevation of looting. And so he was interested in monuments that had made their way into the art market and then ended up in museums ultimately. And there was at that time a question about where certain carved stelae had originated, which archaeological sites, and there was some speculation. And so he actually went on the ground and really looked into where these places were.
These monuments that are here are probably the most important textual monuments at the site. Ian Graham found them, and he documented them and read them, and they register some really important history.
And so he not only provided the drafting of many of the scattered fragments of monuments, various of which the facades had been sawn off and carted away. And so he was doing that work, and in the course of that, he illustrated those that were still there, providing essentially the beginning of that corpus or body of work from that site and many others. He also created a plan map of the site of El Peru using tape and compass and the help of local individuals. And so all of that material was housed at the Corpus of Maya Hieroglyphic Inscriptions at Harvard. And many years later, when my advisor, David Friedel, initiated an interest in working at the site of El Peru as an archaeological project, he negotiated with Harvard and was granted access to Ian's drawings and his map of the site. And so when we started our very first reconnaissance of the site, we had that information with us, which was hugely helpful. That was in 2001. 2003 was the launching of the very first season of El Perú-Waka, and that first season I was a graduate student, as were many of my colleagues in Guatemala and in the US. And those of us who were coming from the graduate program at SMU were working with David Friedel. And my colleagues in Guatemala were working with their advisor, Hector Escobedo, who was the co-director. And I'll just explain that archaeological projects in Guatemala that involve foreign researchers by law have to be matched with the same number of Guatemalan researchers. So it was a really amazing experience to be able to start that work as a PhD student with colleagues in the country and develop those relationships and those friendships from, gosh, like 20 years now that it's been just about. From 2003 to 2006, we worked every spring. As graduate students, we were able to take the spring off and do field work, which was great because spring is the dry season. It makes working and logistics much easier. So in those 4 years, I collected dissertation data. Then I spent the next few years working on my dissertation and trying to launch an academic career. And so I wrote up my dissertation, I was teaching, I finished up, I landed a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of New Mexico, which afforded me the opportunity to go back to the site and conduct research in 2012. And I spent a very long field season that year, which resulted in really important archaeological finds.
We're excavating Burial 61, which is the royal person ruling at Waka, who is here. And we're in the process of picking up the ceramics and other offerings for this person. Just packing some jade beads, the best way I know it.
Esta es una banca. Entonces, normalmente depositaban a las personas encima de la banca, colocaban algunas ofrendas como las que describió Olivia allá, y aquí hay un vaso, un plato, esto se llama un cuenco. Adentro tiene otras 3 piezas más que están cubiertas con estuco y pintadas, y todavía nos falta excavar un montón.
Well, this is the end. We finally made it after how many days of working 12 hours, 14 hours a day? Chica.
10
días. The 16-hour days. 15? I'm exaggerating.
and we still have the space.
And we So now we're gonna go take the last photos of everything and say bye-bye. Ok, estas son las últimas fotos de el entierro 61. Posible mujer, posible reina. Dare I say, maybe the one and only Cabell. We'll wait for the resultados de Stanley y de Aaron, pero posiblemente. A ver qué pasa, a ver qué nos dice el destino. Okay, let's do this. The following fall, I got a job at the College of Wooster, and so I started that position in 2012, and I've been on the project, of course, since that time. As my academic position has advanced, my position on the project has also advanced. In addition to sort of running my own excavation, which I did for those many years, having a greater directorial role on the project, and so now that leads to my position as co-director of the project. As a co-director, I have a number of responsibilities. One of the biggest jobs that I have is promoting the project, but more than that, sort of keeping it afloat financially. I've applied for a number of years to the Alphawood Foundation for research funds, written proposals, various multi-year proposals, and have thankfully received funding and support from them. My other colleagues who work elsewhere or in the States also bring in financial resources as well. But that kind of work also entails having a very clear code and precise understanding of the budgetary costs of running the project, how to get there, what's involved, what are the costs that are accrued, how much does every sort of personnel salary run the project, what are the costs in the way of food, supplies, what's involved in getting those kinds of things back and forth. As a college professor, I'm also constantly thinking about recruiting students who might potentially be interested in conducting research on the project, and in maybe even fewer instances, interested in a long-term relationship with the project and sort of helping usher them into a pipeline of potentially graduate work and research. And all of that is part of, the work of the project. I think too, keeping on top of publications, ensuring that our project is regularly generating research publications in academic contexts, but also speaking publicly about the project in various forums, whether that's locally here in Worcester or more broadly sponsored by the Archaeological Institute of America or at the annual Society for American Archaeology meetings. And so there are different ways in which I try to keep that relationship and my association with the project and awareness of the project moving forward. Our project senior personnel meet every year. In the last couple of years, we've done this over Zoom, but we would previously meet here at the College of Wooster to discuss the logistics and the planning of our field seasons every year. And that would take the form of a very long day of meeting. It also used to involve a trip to Cleveland to go see the monument that is the hallmark of their Ancient Americas collection, which is the stele representation of Lady Cabell, whose tomb we excavated as a project in 2012, just before my arrival to the college. So those experiences together have been really wonderful. It's also been wonderful to see my colleagues in Guatemala get to see the stele of Queen Cabell for the first time. I mean, you can imagine this is a monument not only from their country, but from the site where we've all worked for many years, and it's the first time they have the opportunity to see it. So it's really, really amazing. It is the back side of Stela 34, which is the monument which features Lady Cabell or Queen Cabell. And Ian Graham did not record it here. It was already gone when he got here. So the front face, carved face, was taken off with diamond saw and placed probably on muleback and hiked out of here. And then ended up on the art market and then ultimately at the Cleveland Museum of Art. And the monument is a celebrated piece because it's a very finely carved example of artisan's work, and the front of it is obviously well taken care of in Cleveland. They mounted it in such a way as to replicate the actual dimensions of the monument, and I think they did a really great job. Since I started in Wooster, I've been working in some capacity with the curator there to talk about our research. I've done video interviews for them and helped fill a little bit the story for their audiences and viewership of her history because of finding the burial and being able to talk so comprehensively now about her life.
I would say probably the major responsibility I have as a co-director in my own mind is communicating constantly with my colleagues, particularly one of my co-directors, Juan Carlos Perez. So that first year, 2003, Juan Carlos Perez was a graduate student working at another building doing consolidation work. And that's when we met. So we've worked together for many years. We've developed a strong relationship and friendship. And not just he and I, but the rest of the members of our project who've been together since the beginning. We work with a lot of people on site to help facilitate all of the different needs that are involved in running a project like ours smoothly. That includes staff of people that are working in the kitchen and cooking meals for everybody regularly. We have an excellent cook staff led by Reina Garcia, who has been working with us for many years, and she is an absolute professional in making massive quantities of food and planning out how much and what to purchase and what will be necessary to feed a large group of people. And not only that, but how to sort of reutilize those ingredients in subsequent meals. There's separate eating times for the sort of work crew and then the archaeological crews. So those schedules are also things that have to be negotiated by her in tandem with her staff.
Cocinar, primeramente levantarme temprano, hacer el desayuno, el almuerzo, la cena, como en el 2003 creo. Sí, porque sí, creo que sí, en esa época fue el inicio, 25 parece, 25. Casi 26.
¿Cómo está tu hija? Bien. ¿El Salazar ya tiene un bebé? Sí, también la veo con toda la chica. Sí, o sea, ¿cómo pasan los años? Sí.
Pues trabajaba un muchacho del campesino que se llamaba Isauro y decían que querían cocineras aquí. Entonces él me dijo a mí que si quería venir y yo le dije que si había una oportunidad estaba bien y ya me quedé trabajando aquí.
¿Y a qué hora se levanta todos los días?
Cuando estamos todos a las 3.
¿Y a qué hora se acuesta?
A las 9. Todo el día cocinando, haciendo limpieza, preparando alimentos para el lonche para el sitio.
¿Y es duro?
Sí, es duro.
¿Y le gusta?
Sí, me gusta. Pero siempre, como usted siempre nos ha dicho, y siempre sabemos que sí es importante. Somos importantes nosotros también en la cocina, porque hacemos los alimentos, la comida, para que ustedes tengan fuerza de trabajar. Ajá.
There's a lab facility in our base camp that has to be maintained, and the artifacts that come in every day are washed, labeled, bagged, tagged accordingly by staff there.
Aquí estamos trabajando, somos 3. Estamos trabajando restauración de monumentos, lavado de cerámica, o sea, como un técnico. Lo que más me gusta es lavado de cerámica, restauración de monumentos y dibujo. Incluso ahorita encontramos una figuría. Mucho me gusta sus cachetes. Es una figuría pequeña, bien bonita.
¿Tiene usted algunos planes o ideas de si le gustaría continuar en el proyecto a futuro?
Sí, me encantaría continuar. Anteriormente estuve en mi casa. Pues trabajé ahorita hace 2 años de docente, pero me gusta esto. La importancia que se tiene es que trabajando dentro del proyecto gano muchas experiencias porque yo nunca había trabajado. Incluso Sabemos cómo se trabaja, qué se hace con el material, llega a un museo, un laboratorio. Entonces, aparte del trabajo, entonces vamos como ganando algo, porque llevamos un factor económico a nuestro hogar también. Tengo una nena, mi mamá y mi papá y mis hermanos.
And then there's all the people that are going up to conduct investigations at site every day, which entail a number of crews, sort of a crew for every specific archaeological operation that's open in a given plan. Water and other supplies are regularly brought up to site, and any work that might be going on, like closing up an excavation or doing some consolidation work in the architecture of a particular building, which necessitates a crew of people to create a cement mixture to place into that location. That involves crews of people. And of course, the logistics of managing the excavations. And so we have to have a generator, and we have to have cables connecting the generator to a series of lights which are set up in the tunnels. That means there's light bulbs, of course, and when one burns out, we need to have backup. We need to have all of these sort of little details in place in order to be able to do our work. Fans, which are plugged in and keep the air circulating in the tunnels, and any other material that might be used to cover a particular thing, like a monument or a sensitive area of excavation. All of it necessitates having people and personnel to take care of these different tasks.
Mi trabajo es logística. Logística es ordenar y el campamento y todos los trabajos que puedo hacer, la carpa y las extensiones de la planta, de la motosierra, de la bomba, de la lucha y de las letrinas y de la cocina, y también coordino la comida, cuánto es la comida, lo tenemos que llevar, y también tenemos que llevar un extra, y cuando llevamos la comida allá en el sitio, ¿verdad? En el carro, siempre cuesta caminar también con el carro, y por el camino como se pone también el agua en el invierno, y eso el camino se pone malo. Desde comencé a trabajar aquí el 2014, mi sentimiento en mi trabajo en el proyecto, pues me siento bien orgulloso y para ayudarnos a nosotros, en algo ahí en toda la familia, y no solo para mí, en todos los que trabajamos aquí. Para mí nos ayuda para construir casa, para otra cosa que por ejemplo para la enfermedad, otro tipo de trabajo para nosotros en el campo.
Something that Juan Carlos Perez and Griselda Perez, my colleagues in Guatemala, have initiated, which has been really hugely important and successful in just the first few years that they've piloted this, is hiring women from local communities to work on sort of technical kinds of work.
El segundo tema es la conservación de monumentos. Y es un programa que empezamos en 2017. Y involucramos hasta el momento, van 7 muchachas cerca del sitio. Hay madres solteras y hay muchachas jóvenes graduadas de educación media, maestras o peritos contadores o bachilleres. Y ellas reciben una capacitación sobre patrimonio cultural, patrimonio natural, los mayas y la metodología de levantar deterioros, y este año aprendieron a dibujar. Y es el primer proyecto que tiene a estas muchachas dibujando arqueológicamente. Mujeres muy jóvenes graduadas, ¿verdad? Que a pesar de todos los problemas de su casa, de que no creen ellas o que no las creen capaces ellas se esfuerzan, se gradúan, y creemos con Gris que merecen un espacio igualitario como los otros trabajadores del proyecto. ¿Por qué lleva mujeres al campo? Porque tienen la capacidad, están preparadas y son eficientes en su trabajo y seguiremos reclutando. Y es importante porque ganamos espacios para ellas en trabajos dignos e igualitarios. Ese es un poco el objetivo de esto. Entonces,
estamos trabajando como técnicas en lavado de cerámica. También estamos trabajando en lo que es el monitoreo de monumentos y el dibujo.
La verdad es de que este trabajo nos ha ayudado bastante. Una, en aprender cosas nuevas afuera de todo lo que es allá en los caseríos o en un pueblo, es diferente. Yo me gradué de maestra, pero aquí vengo a ver cosas de los arqueólogos, ayudamos a dibujar, cosas que nos han dado la oportunidad de aprender y en realidad es bueno para uno y para poder tener mejores conocimientos en otros aspectos.
Yo estudié bachillerato. Para mí esta experiencia es mi primera temporada, estoy trabajando, es primer año. El trabajo de un arqueólogo es bastante interesante. Yo nunca me imaginé poder vivir este momento, esta experiencia. Para nosotros fue muy importante. Todo lo que hacemos nunca lo había hecho, nunca había trabajado en el dibujo. Más allá de cuando vamos a un parque arqueológico, solo a veces vamos de pasada, no conocemos los procesos.
They are not only acquiring technical skills and earning a commensurate salary of a technician in the field, they're also importantly breaking a lot of glass ceilings in their own communities. And so they're coming home to their families with a paycheck, with a salary, using tools that have been previously relegated to male use exclusively. They're also not expected to enter into even these heavily forested, high canopy jungle areas, which are referred to locally as monte, and really, on a small scale, but important one, making these really marked changes in their own families and in their own minds, which is really powerful.
Cuando recibieron su dinero de paga, dice, esto es mío, todo tuyo. Voy a dar una parte a mi casa y la otra es para mi universidad. Y con una o dos visiones que cambiemos en las muchachas, que sepan que pueden hacer las cosas, que se enfrentan a su papá a decirle, yo sí puedo, hice esto, ya hemos ganado mucho. Estamos cambiando un poco la visión de las familias.
We want to provide an environment that I think above all provides not just like a dignified workspace, which is critically important, but also a space to feel involved in what they're doing. We simply ask those with whom we work what their knowledge, expertise, understanding is, a dialogue with the archaeologists who have the sort of grand plan for what is to be done, what the plan is, what the objectives are, and the logic of those objectives, but also a space to maybe interrogate those objectives, and deviate from, let's say, a prescribed plan when this individual who works with us maybe has a sense that this might be an alternative and maybe better place to consider investigating. In fact, that very thing happened this season because we had sort of a prescribed method in what our sort of plan looked like, and then in the course of excavation, we came across some features that really beckoned consideration, and the sort of crew chief, if you will, of the excavation that I direct, Manuel Garcia, was sort of looking at this feature, and that resulted in a really important dimension of our season and a really important discovery. And it really germinated from these conversations with Manuel, whose expertise is very vast.
El inicio del interés fue de que sí me gustó trabajar en la arqueología y sí, es muy bonito. Que uno, pues, cuando le gusta algo, uno pone de su parte para aprender más. Pues en tuneleo es un poco diferente que trabajar en superficie. Hay que tener mucha precaución y saber llevar el trabajo y conocer mucho de lo que es el relleno para poder trabajar sin riesgos, sin peligros, sí. Y donde pues a veces está complicado y tenemos que apuntalar para poder trabajar, asegurar los perfiles. asegurar los perfiles. Pero sí es muy bonito y sí me gusta trabajar. Y la diferencia en la superficie es que estamos trabajando afuera en superficie, en investigación, y no vamos muy profundo. En cambio, en túnel pues trabajamos adentro de la subestructura, buscando su estructura, sí, investigando su estructura. Sí, a veces si no tenemos precaución, el arriesgado es para los que trabajamos adentro del túnel. Waka, Perú, tiene muchas cosas bonitas que por descubrir, ¿va? Y me gusta seguir trabajando acá.
So this past field season 2022 has been really remarkable. We've had a couple of really important discoveries in which we will divulge the details as far as we're currently understanding them of these really incredible finds. The first of these that was earlier in the season is actually something that connects to work that we conducted in 2019. In the course of excavating what we believe to be a circular altar that was sort of sticking out of the profile of a tunnel that had been excavated in 2012. So we'd seen this fragment of monument sticking out of the profile wall and sort of thought about that being something we needed to do at some point. And in 2019, that opportunity arose. So we investigated it and we realized that it was abutting behind a standing monument, which was then excavated on its north side and revealing that it was not only a standing monument, but that it had well-preserved text on that side. And we were able to excavate a tiny portion of the front face of it. We could see, okay, that looks like that carved surface is intact. A couple of the interesting details from those early investigations demonstrated that that monument was the second earliest monument dated at the site. So we understood that it was in and referencing a period of political history that's really important in classic Maya political studies. Particularly it pertains to the early classic period. And during this period, there were known relationships between the Maya and the lowlands and many other places registering this interaction between the Maya and Teotihuacan. And the nature of that relationship has always been up for discussion. And so this monument we knew from that time, from 2019, dated to this general historical period. So for that reason alone, we knew it was important and exciting. So Stela 51, which is the number we designated it with, the way that it was situated in the building, it was in the penultimate to final phase, embedded in that architectural phase, which happened to be the least well consolidated fill. Typically this fill is concentrated with large stones. We'll also include some kind of cement or mortaring that keeps everything kind of well consolidated and packed well together. The later phases tend to have less of this or maybe not much at all, which means that there's basically rubble which can just collapse in on itself. And that was more the kind of situation that we had surrounding Stela 51, which meant we couldn't really go further in 2019, and we looked forward to 2020, which didn't happen at all. So then we looked at 2021, and that was the time in which we were able to reveal the face of the monument, which resulted in understanding that that monument was essentially decapitated. So it was a standing figure that had no head. These monuments also must be understood and must be stated that the people that are represented on them, they're not just sort of representations of people, they can be considered the individuals themselves. And so they're deeply ritually and politically charged objects. They have their own life. And so the decapitation of something like that is literally meant to indicate the defacement of that individual portrayed, or whatever history is included in that. So this had happened, this decapitation had happened in some earlier period. And then later it was reset in the location in which we found it with the missing head. The important thing to bear in mind too is that in order to clear the front surface in 2021, which was still very much within the pandemic, the excavation had to occur from outside. So we couldn't work inside the tunnel because of the circulation of air and all of that. So the excavation happened from the summit of the building down. And as the monument was cleared of this loose rubble, simultaneous to that, from the ground or the floor up, archaeologists and conservators and masons had to create a wall to stabilize the building so that it wouldn't just sort of collapse. We couldn't just look at the monument. We had to build consolidation walls around it. That work all took place in 2021. And in 2022, this season, at the start of the season, that work of consolidating around Stela 51 and specifically completely exposing the south side of the monument was part of that work in 2022. Part of that investigation also included taking a look at that altar. This had been exposed all since 2012. And this is an altar. We've been meaning to deal with this feature. We should look at it. So we started to do that. Well, as it turned out, that altar was not an altar. It was the upper section, the missing head of the standing individual. And it has continuing texts on both sides and on the front faces of both sides of that monument, which have yielded really important political information of the period. And so the political information mentions really important individuals, historical figures who are known to play important roles in the political interactions of the time, including an individual who is identified as coming from the West, a really key figure. His name is Siakak, translated to Fire is Born. We believe he is mentioned or referenced on the monument. And so this individual, Siakak, was, according to the texts, on the errand of an individual that is known as Spirit Thrower Owl. The name has been more recently considered by David Stewart to more accurately be Owl Striker. Hatsum Kui is his name in Mayan, is also named on this monument. He is presumed to be the ruler or a ruler at Teotihuacan, the sort of center of power in that time in Mesoamerica. It is a really important city that housed communities from different ethnic groups from across Mesoamerica. It was truly a cosmopolitan city and features architecture and a gridded layout that is really unparalleled in the rest of Mesoamerica. This city and the members of the political elite had a relationship with the Maya area, as I mentioned before, and the monument, Stela 51, illustrates further information about that relationship by mentioning some of these important individuals of the period and what relationship they may have had with the city of Waka, which situates Waka at an elevated political level that we didn't previously understand it had. And we're sort of beginning now as we really delve into the decipherment of what's on Stela 51, but preliminarily it seems like we can say that we're starting to grasp just how politically important Waka was at the time. Yeah, these knee tassels are really diagnostic here. The feathered shield, the staff, the way he's dressed, and this bowl with this kind of like this motif on the front of it and the fire feathers coming out of it. I am just in awe of this. It's like textbook Teotihuacan. So it is incredibly important and will be followed in terms of its decipherment, its reading, the implications of the history, probably for the next 30 years. So this is the first part of the season, which is already a striking find. I mentioned previously that our crew chief, Manuel Garcia, who we work with and who's from the community of Dolores in Peten, has a great deal of expertise and experience working at different sites in addition to working with us. He was also working in the crew that investigated the substructure of this building. So we are now 3 substructures into the building. And so when I say that, what I mean is that the Maya built over existing structures, layering these subsequent or posterior architectural phases over the previous one. And so when we excavate into these earlier phases, what we essentially do is penetrate a small section of that architecture, and then you excavate until you hit the architecture from the previous phase, which is usually very close behind it, and then you follow that. So subphase 3, or substructure 3, is an early classic building that we also discovered in 2019. We discovered sort of the front stair of that building and a couple of inset corners of that building. And fast forwarding to 2022, the goal was to continue defining that architecture to sort of understand the full extent of at least that sector, that south sector of the building. In the course of that work, archaeologists came upon, following the floor and the base of the wall, they came upon a feature which looked to be a stuccoed platform. So we sort of jumped over the top of that platform, and then the floor was found again, and it continued up to the corner of that building, that south wall. In the exposure of that south wall, as I mentioned earlier, Manuel noted this clear feature right above the area where the platform was located on that wall, which had a smooth application of stucco on it, that stucco sort of stops, and you see cut stones and patches of mortar around it. And I remember having a conversation with my good friend Michelle Rich on the phone, asking her too, what is the best course? Because this really was a deviation from the original plan. We had planned to penetrate the south side of the fronting staircase of that building. And instead, we followed this feature. We sort of decided collectively that as anthropologists, it was really important to look at the human action. We excavated down inside the building and saw several stones that looked to be like capstones of some kind. And so we looked at the way those capstones inside the building corresponded to this platform that was sticking out on the other side, and began to realize that this was part of the same feature. And in the course of that exposure, we discovered a small opening, no more than 5 to 10 centimeters wide. And we could see that we were looking inside an open space that had distinguishable masonry in the interior wall. And so essentially we'd found a chamber. Over the course of the next few days, the delicate thing was to figure out how to make that small opening large enough to allow us to get in and out of, and we weren't certain at that point whether there might be any archaeological material in it, because the Maya in antiquity not only revisited tombs, but sometimes themselves cleaned tombs out, or sometimes when you had enemy attacks, those tombs might be desecrated. We were able to remove enough material to maintain the stability of the architectural feature, and then within the next couple of days, we began to expose what was inside and discovered that indeed it was what was designated as Burial 110, a royal tomb. It had not been cleaned out. There were archaeological materials in there, and human remains, a number of vessels, and pieces of worked jade. We could see from the east a really kind of typically early classic Maya arrangement, a triad of circular vessels and ear spools and other jades. But really interestingly, to the west, and geographically Teotihuacan is in the west, we saw immediately tripod supports, scutate-lidded vessels, which clearly identify them as Teotihuacan style. Much remains to be seen at this point, but I think it's really interesting that you have this kind of international tomb where you have objects that clearly demonstrate a Teotihuacan affiliation in the western sector and objects that clearly demonstrate a very ethnically, culturally Maya identification in the eastern sector. But preliminarily, what we know is that it's early classic in date from the diagnostics of the ceramics that we've seen. And we can say that the individual who's interred there is really an important ancestral figure because of the way that this platform is situated, because of the way the scaffolding was likely placed over it. That platform, which I should mention had post holes that had been dug into the interior corner where the platform abutted against the building. So there had to have been some perishable roof over that, and or it had been the location of some kind of scaffolding that would have been built of perishable material over that. It would have been a place of reverence and ceremony. We think it might even have been a location of an accession platform where Maya rulers would accede into kingship or a houseship over the remains of sacred ancestors. We suspect it might be possible that there are more than one individual. Maybe we're seeing an individual that was interred with this person of importance. Perhaps there are ancestor bundles that were placed there subsequently. We do see evidence of one possible re-entry episode, but definitely more to come in the years ahead. And we're really, really excited about what incredible season we've had this year.